Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. This is Peter Exodus O'Coffer, and today I'm going to cover Elton John. Elton John and branding. Elton John's numbers are kind of quiet, but there's various ways and there's various lists out there as far as best-selling artists go, and some of them have Elton John in the top five, but pretty much all of them have Elton John in the top 10. And as I go further in into the history portion of the channel and talk about different things, essentially I'm gonna there's the way I look at it, there's four different kind of economic uh, state or eras or stages in popular music, and just in general. A lot of it is technology based. So one is what I would call the singles era, and that's really from the late 40s when um, well, let's go back further. Let's go back to the jazz era. In that era, um, it was radio based, unless yeah, it was pretty much radio based. I mean, Frank Sinatra, was radio based because most households did not have a record player, and at the time back then it was 78 RPM. So when Miles Davis came on the scene in the late 40s, his first few albums, even going into the early 50s, were on 78s, not 33s. So most of the music from that era was uh, uh, you got from radio. The rich and elites, they had radios. The second era then is the singles era, where and I'll do a podcast on this eventually, where Elvis was king, and by the mid '60s, when the Beatles dropped Help, that was the start of the album era. And so that's also these are all of this is the record era too. And this all goes up until Napster in 99 2000, and that's when we become into a different era. And we have the digital slash CD era, and probably 20 from 2000 to 2010, and now I call this the streaming era. So when I say all that, because there are some lists out that try to combine album sales, and sometimes even conflate album sales and single sales and streams, and I just that gets a little dicey in my opinion, because I know I think how they define sales unit when it comes to streams has changed multiple times in the last 10 years or so. So when I say Elton John is in the top five or top 10 in album sales for most lists, that is the record album era I'm talking about. He had a great run in the '70s. I mean, that's his bread and butter when he really did good. From 1972 to 1976, he had six number one albums in a row. The only other act, from the '70s that best at is Led Zeppelin. I think from certainly from Led Zeppelin 4 on, every album Zeppelin put out, and I think that 4 was '72, went number one. And that's quite a record. I think the only one now who's close to that, who has a string of number ones like that, is Beyonce. I think maybe her first didn't hit number one, her solo album, or maybe her second, but every other album by Beyonce's hit number one. So that's but Elton John is kind of his ring of string of number one albums, and obviously the Beatles had a long string too. But he's there, in the conversation with the people I just named. So when Elton John, first of all, I mean, he has a co-writer, Bernie Taupin. So Bernie does all the lyrics, and this has been from, his first record on, and he does all the music, and it's a great partnership. I mean, they're both in the Songwriters Hall of Fame, and obviously Elton John is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame too. But coming out of the gate, Elton John had a problem because he knew nobody wanted to sit and watch a guy at a piano and playing and whatnot. Um, so he's like, well, how do I make my show interesting? And what he did, I mean, we all know Elton John was gay. He leaned into his queerness and basically embraced that at a time when it was, it's still, I mean, it still is not fun being LGBTQ, in America and in the world, but it was even worse back then. So he had the courage to lean into that. And, so he had these flashy, costumes and the hats and the glasses and all that. And again, he had to do that, and the other thing too that was interesting about Elton John, and I'll get into this even more. I'm just gonna keep rolling with it, but to this day, he's still on classic rock radio stations. And back then, he was not just top 40, but classic rock radio stations. And his music is not guitar based. I mean, as I said earlier, he's right there with Led Zeppelin as far as, album sales for the 70s. And he was played on the same radio stations that Led Zeppelin was played on. Um, you know, Zeppelin was mainly on the FM album oriented stations. I don't know how much AM because their songs, Led Zeppelin only did one single, and that was A Whole Lot of Love. Every other, Stairway to Heaven was never a single, and because they didn't do singles, they weren't worried about how long a song was. So, but Elton John was on top 40, but he was on, you know, the album oriented rock radio stations that ruled in the 70s with Led Zeppelin and Aerosmith and Kiss and AC/DC. And he's still on those same playlists, running with those guys. And name an Elton John song with a guitar solo. It doesn't exist, and though in the '70s the bands I just named were all about hard rock guitars and guitar solos, and so it's pretty amazing actually what Elton John did. In the '70s, in the era where he was really big, because he really, he competed in two different fields and did well in both fields. And one of the things that intrigues me about Elton John is when I think of great piano players in general. Now I don't know how he stacks up against jazz pianists, because we all know jazz pianists or jazz players in general get a lot of respect for their mastery of their instrument. And when it comes to when I think of pop music or non-jazz and the piano, I think Elton John number one and Billy Joel number two. But Elton used the piano even more so than Billy Joel. I mean, Billy Joel had Piano Man and I can't think of the other one where it was two hits that were really piano heavy, but Big Shot and Just the Way You Are. I mean, the piano's there, but Elton starts, a lot of his big songs off with the piano and brings things in afterwards. But the piano's front and center with him, and just what he got out of that piano. I mean, and I'm sure his skills as a pianist is probably through the roof and is great, but he kind of became one with that piano, and he gets sounds out of that piano that nobody in rock, pop, and for that matter even R&B is able to do. So to me, he just when it comes to popular music and the piano, I think of Elton John, because he just kind of, it's almost like he's inseparable from his piano and his piano sound. So yeah, this is a short one, but Elton John, what stands out is, I mean, the courage to lean into his, the fact he was a gay man in the '70s. Um, it paid off. He is an icon. I mean, when AIDS came, he was, he jumped into that fight. Was tireless and continuously spoke out. To try to save uh, men in his community. So he's a that makes him a global leader and a humanitarian. And man, he can just write some beautiful songs and just make some beautiful sounds with that piano. So I mean, Elton John and Brandon. I mean, it goes back to courage and ultimately when you listen to my stuff on branding, it's lean into who you are and uh, you got to roll with who you are and at least the aspects that you're comfortable about. And in this case, it took a lot of courage to get comfortable with some of those aspects, but he leaned into it, and he's a legend. The numbers speak for themselves, the sales speak for themselves, the respect, across the board, and the amongst his fellow musicians speak for itself. So Elton John and Brandon, a legend, and boy, he's a brand. I mean, he has a look that will, you know, at name, image, likeness. He nailed that. And then put good music to it as well. So, gonna sign off a short, quick one, but stay tuned. More episodes are coming.